Okay, I know what this video is called, but don't get too angry. Or do, I'm not your dad. The point is, I have some thoughts about Pathfinder, the tabletop role playing game, not the mid-size SUV. And since I'm still stuck in this empty void, I figure I might as well express those thoughts. Hello and welcome to the Chemist's Codex. I'm Peter and I like to talk about chemistry and movies and D&D and whatever else might catch my interest. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss when I upload a new video. So what do I mean when I say I have thoughts about Pathfinder? Well, based on the title of this video, you might have deduced that they're not exactly positive. And while I wouldn't disagree with that statement, I would say that it's a bit more nuanced than that. Now, before I get too far into the weeds of this video, I do want to emphasize something. The views I'm expressing are my own opinions. They are not any sort of objective fact, and I'm not portraying them as such. If you disagree with me, that's fine. If Pathfinder is your preferred TTRPG to play, I'm not going to tell you that your fun is wrong. Another thing I want to emphasize is that I haven't actually played that much Pathfinder before. I've played a fair amount of D&D 3.5, which I think is very comparable to Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I haven't even touched Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I'm not going in blind. I've looked at the basic rules, I've looked at the mechanics, I've watched some videos about the game, so I feel like I have a good idea of what the system is. And frankly, my issues pertain more to the fan base rather than the actual system itself. Now, those of you who aren't super familiar with tabletop role playing games might already be a little bit confused. You might be asking yourself, what's Pathfinder? There are different editions of Dungeons and Dragons, or perhaps a third question. And before I get into my particular issues with Pathfinder, I figure I'll give some historical context. Before Dungeons and Dragons, there was wargaming. People would build armies and meet up to pit their armies against each other. And different groups liked to incorporate different things. Some were more interested in historical accuracy, while others liked to include fantasy elements. And as the hobby developed, some of these players found themselves being more interested in portraying a single character rather than controlling an entire army. In the early 70s, Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin created a rule set for medieval wargaming called Chainmail. And another colleague of Gygax's, Dave Arneson, used this rule set to resolve combat in a game he was running, where players would control individual characters that introduced things like character classes, experience points, and armor class. When Arneson showed Gygax this, the two began collaborating on something they initially called the Fantasy Game, which would eventually become Dungeons and Dragons. The original edition of Dungeons and Dragons was released in 1974 as a box set that included three more sort of pamphlets than actual books, titled Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. A few years later, in 1977, TSR, the publishing company that Gary Gygax helped found, released the Dungeons and Dragons basic set. This cleaned up the rules, made them more presentable and easier to understand. Then, later that same year, they released Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or AD&D, which was meant to be the sort of next step for players who had exhausted what the basic set had to offer. AD&D became a lot more popular than the basic set. It introduced the three core rulebooks that are still used today: the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And for most of the 80s, this is the version that people played. In 1989, TSR released Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition. This was sort of in response to the backlash the game received during the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. Second edition removed a lot of controversial aspects, things like demons or devils, and removing a lot of sexually suggestive artwork. Second edition also moved away from the traditional sword and sorcery of the 1970s and more into mythology and history. It also introduced a lot of popular settings that blended genres, things like horror or sci fi. In 1997, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR and Dungeons and Dragons and started work on a third edition of the game. In 2000, that third edition was released, and it was a massive overhaul of the game. It was no longer separated into basic and advanced versions, character creation was a lot more flexible, and it was designed to be internally consistent with the rules. A few years later, a revised edition called 3.5 was released with hundreds of minor changes to the rules. Now, this is where Paizo comes in. Paizo was a company contracted by Wizards of the Coast to publish the Dragon and Dungeon magazines, which were the official magazines for D&D source material. When Wizards of the Coast canceled that contract, Paizo started publishing their own Pathfinder periodical, which was still compatible with 3.5. When Wizards of the Coast announced that they were working on a fourth edition of Dungeons and Dragons, many employees at Paizo became concerned, largely due to the more restrictive license that 4E was under. And this uncertainty led Paizo to publishing their own Pathfinder role playing game. The first edition of Pathfinder was really just a modified version of D&D 3.5. It featured a lot of changes that made things more balanced, changing how many hit points certain classes got, or the function of several spells. Then in 2019, Paizo released Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It was meant to be a more streamlined version of the game, very similar to how D&D has streamlined its own rules since the days of 3.5. So there's the historical background I wanted to mention. When talking about TTRPGs, especially those with multiple editions, it's very common to refer to them as whatever edition number followed by E. For example, Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 would be 3.5E, or more commonly just 3.5. 5th edition would be 5E. So Pathfinder would be Pathfinder 1E or Pathfinder 2E. You get the idea. Another thing I want to mention before I get into my thoughts on Pathfinder is that TTRPGs are often talked about in terms of mechanical crunch. What this means is that a more complex system is referred to as crunchy. Something like D&D 3.5 is typically a good example of this. It has a lot of intricate, complex rules that can interact with each other in complex ways. Whereas something like Monster of the Week is referred to as a rules light system because it has a single set of rules that are very easy to understand at a quick glance. Now, before I get into my grievances with Pathfinder, I figure I'll mention some of the things that I actually like. First, I like that there are multiple options for a fantasy TTRPG. I think it's good that players can experience other things and choose the system that they prefer. Another thing I like about Pathfinder, specifically with 2nd edition, is the idea of the 3-action economy, where you have 3 actions in a given round and you can spend them however you choose. I also think Pathfinder 2nd edition is a step in the right direction compared to 1st edition. It feels like it makes the game more accessible to new players, which is always a plus. So, what don't I like about Pathfinder? There are some issues that I have with the actual system itself, which I will get into, but what really motivated me to make this video is an issue I have with a certain type of player in the Pathfinder community. See, I come across a lot of Dungeons and Dragons related content on social media, and oftentimes in the comments there will be someone saying, just play Pathfinder, or Pathfinder fixes this, especially if the post is critiquing D&D. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with recommending Pathfinder to someone, if that person asked for a recommendation. To me, these people come across like they act like Pathfinder is the best system in the world and it is flawless, which is far from the truth. So allow me, someone who doesn't particularly like Pathfinder, to express why someone might not want to play that system. First off, I'm not a fan of mechanical crunch. Pathfinder 1E especially suffers from the sometimes overwhelming level of mechanical crunch that D&D 3.5 does. I don't think it requires a dissertation to describe how to grapple someone. I understand a lot of people like the mechanical crunch, and I've even enjoyed the mechanical crunch when I've embraced it. But I feel like a lot of people think that just because the system is crunchy, then it's good. And don't get me wrong, D&D 5e is still a very crunchy system, but it feels more manageable. Pathfinder is plagued with floating modifiers and hyper-specific conditions that feel like a slog to keep track of. And I have seen several people online mention that Pathfinder 2e is a lot easier to run as a GM, but I've seen other people mention that that's because it puts a lot more of this onto the players, and that can turn someone off from trying out Pathfinder. My next point is kind of related. Pathfinder 2e has too many character options, specifically feats. Looking at Archive of Nethys, Pathfinder 2e has over 5,000 feats. And granted, not all of these are available to a player at any given point. Between ancestry feats and prerequisites, it does get narrowed down. But that's still a lot of feats for someone to sort through when they're building their character. Having a lot of options can be fun. Believe me, I love character options. It allows someone to build the exact character that they want. But when there are so many hyper situational and specific feats, a player is liable to forget that they have that feat when the situation to use it finally arrives. And for new players, they might not even know what feat would be best for them to take. A common point I see brought up regarding the amount of character options is that it allows for more creativity, which I greatly disagree with. Yes, having these hyper specific things can allow for more creativity in building your character, but when the time finally comes to use that ability in that hyper specific situation, it just feels forced and unnatural. And while we're talking about creativity, I want to throw my opinion into the mix. I would argue that more creativity comes from the general rules that cover a broader scope. See, I find it more interesting and fun when players find uncommon ways to use their character's abilities. It still happens in specific situations, but they have to think of it in the moment and they're not even sure if their idea is even feasible. As a GM, these are some of my favorite moments. And unless something is impossible or explicitly forbidden by the rules, I'll let the player at least try. There's my GM tip for the day. Let your players do cool, creative things. I'm also going to take this opportunity to get a little mean. Apologies in advance if I offend you. I've seen some people complain about D&D combat, saying it's just get into position and attack bad guy until they're dead, and I'm not going to lie, I've done this before, both as a player and a DM. However, I don't blame D&D for this. I blame myself. When combat has gotten boring and repetitive, it's usually because I've stopped describing what I'm doing beyond I attack the monster or the monster attacks you. If you want more interesting combat, you have to put in the effort to make it interesting. Describe your attacks, say where you're placing your attacks, put in any sort of flavor into your game. Okay, mini rant over. So what's the point of all this? I don't think Pathfinder is a bad system. I actually think it's a really well designed system. And with the right group and GM, I could see myself really enjoying it. And like I said earlier, Pathfinder 2E is a great improvement on the first edition, but it's still not that accessible to new players. For all its faults, and there are many faults, D&D 5e is still an incredibly accessible system. It's not necessarily easier to play. Like I said, it's still a very crunchy system, but it has incredible name recognition. Hopefully, I don't need to say why. And between all the actual plays that use the system, a person can easily pick up the basics through osmosis. Although, like I said earlier, I think it's important for players to have multiple options for TTRPGs. And if you're like me and don't really like a crunchy system, let me tell you that Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons are not the only options out there for heroic fantasy. There's an entire slew of TTRPGs that provide that niche, and odds are one of them will appeal to you. But there's one system that I want to talk about in particular, that being Dungeon World. Dungeon World is a rules light system using the Powered by the Apocalypse game engine. It has all the same things that D&D and Pathfinder do. Dragons, dwarves, elves, magic, bags of holding, various other fantasy tropes. Dungeon World was originally published in 2012, and even though it's fairly old, it still has a fairly active community. The copy of the book that I have was from the 11th printing in 2021. And after 13 years, it's actually getting a new edition that's expected to release later this year. The common pitch that I see for Dungeon World is that it's what you think D&D will be like before you actually play D&D. If you like the heroic fantasy of D&D and Pathfinder, but don't really like the mechanical crunch, then I highly recommend you check out Dungeon World. I would also mention Daggerheart, the new fantasy TTRPG put out by Critical Role's Darrington Press, but at the time of recording this video, the game actually hasn't fully released. However, from what I've seen from the open beta and the one-shots Critical Role has done, I am super excited to see what the game has to offer. So that brings us to the end of the video. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me while I ramble about various TTRPG systems. And don't forget to subscribe if you're not already so you don't miss when I upload next. And I will see you all in the next video.